When producing any product that contains wheat flour, it's important to understand the role of gluten in the production process. Wheat flour contains two very important proteins called gluten and gluten. These are present within starch or wheat. When we add some form of liquid to our starch or wheat, and if we activate it in terms of move it and add warmth, we end up forming a protein called gluten. Sometimes it's really desirable to have gluten when we're making pastry-based products. For instance, when we're making puff pastry, it's important to have gluten present because we need that elasticity that gluten provides in order to stretch the dough and create the many layers that are synonymous with puff pastry. However, in a product such as a sweet pastry, it's less desirable to have gluten present, so we try and avoid conditions in which gluten can be activated. So in that situation, what we tend to do is we coat the flour particles in the pastry with some form of fat, usually butter or margarine, and that way we try to prevent some of the liquid, either water or egg, being absorbed into the starch granules and hydrating them, and that providing the conditions for gluten to develop. Okay, so let's look at this in practice. Here we're going to show a wee clip on how to make sweet pastry. So we're using the creaming method, so we're going to cream the butter and sugar in this process with an egg and then fold in the flour. So as you'll note in the next clip, the butter and the icing sugar is being creamed to ensure that there are no lumps. We then add an egg to it, which is the binding ingredient in the process. This is followed by the soft flour, which is mixed in. During this process, most of the flour particles are coated in butter, thus preventing the starch granules from absorbing the liquid, which in this case is the egg. This will ensure that we have prevented gluten from being developed to an extensive amount. It can then be used for products such as tartlets. In this case here we have a lemon tart. The dough is then put into the fridge to allow it to firm up and to relax the gluten, but also to allow some of that butter to set as well. Once it's been in the fridge for at least half an hour, it can then be taken out and, as in this clip here, rolled out or pinned out. It's really important when rolling out sweet pastry, or any pastry for that matter, that we roll it out in a circular direction. That will ensure that the pastry contracts evenly. If we were to roll only in one direction, then we could end up having various sort of oblong shapes or uneven shrinking. In particular, if pastry hasn't been given sufficient time to rest, it can shrink in the oven. So in this clip we just pinned out the pastry to about 3 millimeters, trimming any excess pastry because it will overhang and prevent our tartlet shell from cooking evenly. Again, taking the flan ring, the pastry, depending on its softness, sometimes if it's a particularly warm day we might need to just place it in the fridge just to firm up a little bit, but in this case it's not too bad, is lightly placed into the ring. And notice how the lecturer there is trying to push it right into the corners. We're looking for that very sharp 90-degree angle on the corner. So a quality point of any tartlet is that the pastry is at 90 degrees in the corner of the flan. This is really important in terms of presentation of the final product. Here we see that the lecturer is taking particular time just to ensure that that case has happened. Once it's been lined, it needs to be placed into the fridge for about half an hour for the gluten to relax. This is really important. The refrigeration process is there to allow the gluten strands to contract and relax so we prevent shrinkage in the oven, but also to allow some of the butter to firm up as well and help set that pastry. But its primary role is to ensure that it relaxes the gluten. Then the shell is lined with, in this case, some foil, and it's there to support the walls during the baking process. It's usually filled with some kind of product. In this case we call them baking beans, which is a mixture of rice and various dried beans, and their role is to support the walls so we prevent the pastry from falling down, the walls from falling down during the baking process. Then goes into the oven at about 190 degrees for the first initial stage of baking. Once it's been there for about 10 minutes, we take the beans out and we can then continue cooking the pastry. So the production of sweet pastry is a really good example of how we can prevent gluten from being developed through coating starch with fat. In the next example, which is puff pastry, we're going to look at how we can actually use gluten to our advantage. Now in the example of puff pastry, we actually want to develop some of the gluten which exists within the starch. This is because we want to create a dough which is very stretchy. Through the elasticity which is created in the dough, we can layer it with butter through the rolling and folding process. This will result in a dough which has many layers of butter and pastry. So let's look at how we can develop and relax gluten through the example of puff pastry.
Puff pastry. It's often used in the sweet kitchen, but sometimes in the savoury kitchen. We start the process by making what we call ourselves a base dough. It's made from hard flour, in this case 500 grams. We've got 25 ml of white wine vinegar, 10 grams of salt, 50 grams of unsalted butter which has been melted, and to that we add 200 to 225 ml of cold water. The water will vary each time just depending on the type of flour and quality of flour. It's important that we bring all of those ingredients together to form a relatively smooth and soft ball. This is what we call the base dough, and it's this dough that we add the additional butter to cause the laminating or the many layers of butter and fat. So in this case here we're just adding a little bit more water to it. It was a little bit dry. You can see there, just adding a little bit more. So there will be a bit of a variance every single time you make it. Kneading it by hand here, bringing it together, working it, developing some of that gluten. We add the white wine vinegar to the dough. It's quite important because it actually strengthens the gluten, gives it a bit of elasticity, and helps it later on with the rolling and stretching process that the dough undergoes. There you can see we've just probably worked it for about a minute and a half here, and we've brought together our base dough, trying to keep it smooth. We don't want to overwork it, otherwise it's going to be difficult to roll out later on. We just place a little cross on it, and this is how we're going to incorporate the butter later on. It's then placed into the fridge and allowed to set for about half an hour. In this clip here we've taken 450 grams of unsalted butter. On the corner of a bench where it's a little bit sturdier, we've got the diced butter, and we're just working it with the back of a rolling pin, and what we're creating there is sort of making the butter more malleable. One of the really important steps of making puff pastry with butter is that the base dough and the butter are at the same consistency or the same texture. This helps with even rolling later on, and also prevents the butter bursting through the dough if it's too firm. So it's quite an important step. Once the dough is rested in the fridge for around about the half an hour mark, we then what we call pin out the cross that you cut previous. These are called the ears of the puff pastry, and we just simply pin them out. And what we're doing is we're creating an envelope that we can then place the butter inside of. There'll be a little bump in the middle there. We can place the butter in the middle of the dough and fold it up and incorporate the butter into the dough, and then we can proceed to rolling out the dough and creating the laminated effect that we want. Here we are, just squaring up the base dough, or the base butter, sorry, and placing it in the middle. It's important that the top layering of the dough and the base layering of the dough are at the same thickness, so that it's evenly captured with the base dough there. Just pinning it out a little bit to work with it. Okay, now it's ready to incorporate what we call a turn. You'll probably, once you've incorporated the butter, you'll probably be able to achieve maybe one turn into it. Here we are, pinning out the pastry, trying to keep even pressure across the pastry so that we don't have any bursting of butter coming out. And you can see in the demonstration there we're trying to keep all of the ends square at all times. That's important so that we end up with an even rise later on. and here we are incorporating what we call a single turn. So we're folding the top down and the bottom up, and that's a single turn, or a single book fold it's also known as. Just batting it out lightly. That will then go back in the fridge and rest for about half an hour, marking it with the indentation. Once it's rested for about half an hour, we can then roll the pastry out again and incorporate another turn. We may even be able to incorporate 2 turns in this process. So here we are rolling it out to a long rectangle again, and we're going to do a technique of putting in a single turn again. Just see here, bottom up, top down, and a good trick is bottom up, top down, and turning it clockwise. That's now had 2 turns, and marking it as appropriate. We can incorporate what we call a double turn into the process. So here we are making what we call the classic double turn, or double book. In total we need to have 6 turns. We need to rest the pastry 20 minutes between each turn. Once we've incorporated all 6 turns, it's now ready for pinning out for use. So this dough here has had 6 turns. The process will take about 4 hours to achieve that from start to finish, and now we're just pinning out the pastry and making it ready for use. You can see it's on a lightly floured bench, and working the pastry evenly across the bench, again applying even pressure, which is quite important. There you go. It's also important to note that before we go to use our pastry, we need to, after rolling it out and before baking, we need to rest it. That allows the gluten in the dough to relax again. In this case we're putting it in a bit of greaseproof paper, rolling it up and placing it back into the fridge. If you have a look at the next clip, you'll observe what happens if we take a cutter and we cut the pastry straight away. It'll no longer be round, it will actually start to go into more of an oblong shape as you'll notice in the next clip here. So I hope that helps you with the production of puff pastry. We've got a few pointers here to remember. Try and get the base dough and the butter at the same consistency. To ensure even lamination, keep the dough square at all times. It will help with even rise. Allow the dough to rest for at least 20 minutes between each turn, and try to keep the dough cool at all times. It'll be easier to work with that way. And last but not least, always rest your pastry before cutting and baking. Here we've got a couple of examples of what you can do with puff pastry. Here's the classic apple tart tartane. This is what we call gâteau pétivier, or the puff pastry and frangipane tart, and probably the more well-known pie.